At a time when customers take their best experience in any context and apply it to every context, public sector contact centre, IT and marketing professionals face a heavy burden. Not only do they need to meet the expectations of great customer experiences, but they must also deliver services that are cost efficient, transparent and compliant at a level that's often not found in the private sector. And their customers, who are the citizens of Commonwealth, state and local governments, often feel a special proprietorial ownership that isn't really available or isn't really present in the public sector. My name is Andrew Birmingham. I'm the editor of Which 50, and today's webinar discusses the transformation of customer service and customer experience through the application of digital technologies like AI, machine learning and cloud computing. Today we have three senior executives with direct experience working with the public sector to reveal their own learnings and their insights on the specific challenges government departments and agencies face in implementing cloud-based contact centre solutions. In our agenda today, we'll cover four issues. We'll be looking at providing the end-to-end view of customer relationships to improve the citizen experience, reducing cost, but also reducing time to value through ease of innovation and continuous improvement, the business drivers of cloud migration, including risk minimisation, and finally, we'll be looking at managing compliance and data sovereignty. Our speakers today include two executives who not only have strong hands-on knowledge of these issues, but also have been independently recognised as top 25 customer experience influencers in Australia. Fiona Keogh, who I'm sure is known to many of you, is the CEO of AHS Contacts Association, Australia's peak industry body for contact centres, and Justin Tippet is the founder of the CX Group Australia. We also have Jim Chrysakos, who's the National Solutions Manager for Customer Experience at NEC Australia. As a technology specialist, who's going to help us interrogate some of the issues at an infrastructure level. This is the third of three webinars. The other webinars will be available online shortly. We'll make those available to those of you who want them. And finally, just before we begin the conversation today, I'd like to encourage everybody to ask questions. The way this works is we will collect your questions through the webinar, and then we'll ask the questions at the end rather than interrupting the flow of the conversations. If you have a specific question for one of the panelists, we'll pass that question along and it'll be between yourselves and them as to how that gets followed up. But first today, I want to introduce Fiona Keogh, who is the CEO of AHS Contacts Association Australia. Fiona, welcome to the broadcast.
Hello, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you. Fiona, while many of our guests will be familiar with your association, for those who aren't, can you just tell us a little bit about its mission and its membership? And in particular, can you talk a bit about the challenges that your members face on a day-to-day basis?
Well, Andrew, I could probably talk for the whole webinar on that, but I promise I'll keep it fairly succinct. So AHS Contact was formed in 2014 through the merger of two associations that had a long and esteemed heritage in the contact centre space in Australia. One of them, in fact, going back as far as 1989. AHS Contacts' vision is to be the united voice for the customer contact industry in Australia, connecting people, industries and organisations both locally and globally to deliver excellence in the customer contact experience. And we're linked very closely regionally with the Contact Centre Association for APAC. Our mission is to lead and support our member businesses with their customer contact capability. Now, you asked me a double-barrel question, and that's what are the challenges that people are facing on a day-to-day basis? And this is quite a long list. So our members are telling us that their most common challenge is really how to define and measure appropriately what a great customer experience looks like, especially around personalisation. And then, of course, we have the age-old challenges like unplanned leave, retention of talent, complexity of interactions, rising customer expectations, compliance, security, and most recently, the Royal Commission that has extended its influence well past banking, finance, and insurance. So we have a lot of balls up in the air that are challenges on a day-to-day basis.
That's a good comprehensive overview of the day-to-day challenges. The other thing I wanted to get you to talk to today, to set the context for the discussion today, is really to kind of look at the bigger picture trends, and in particular, the changing expectations on contact centre managers and agents, as customer experience takes centre stage in the way organisations think about the interactions they have with their customers or their constituents. So perhaps if you could walk us through some of those bigger trends that people are facing now.
Yes, well, again, a big question with not so big an answer. So customer experience from Oz Contacts perspective has really been front and centre for well over a decade, especially for the more, shall we call them, mature operations where a number of banks have always measured themselves on either net promoter score or customer satisfaction and have actually had their bonuses linked to that performance. The difference now is really that customers are much better informed or ill-informed, as the case may be, and as they undertake their own research. And of course, we now have statistics that are telling us that up to 90% of the heads of organisations are stating publicly that the way that they will differentiate their business or organisation is by providing a superior customer experience. But the gap that comes with that as well is that this is not actually translating throughout the organisation. There are disconnected measures, disconnected processes that are not linked to understanding or necessarily delivering a great customer experience. We have the Internet of Things, RPA, self-service, crowdsourcing, etc. They're all really prevalent activities that your customers are undertaking, and they don't necessarily need the human touch. But the species, our species, has not evolved past the human touch being extremely critical. And this is where our centre managers and our agents are right at the heart of everything that's being done. They work in an extremely complex and usually vexed environment at the time, because by the time they're having a conversation or interacting with the customer, it's not because the customer is on the phone saying, gee, thank you for my electricity bill, or thank you for my bill for, I don't know, water or whatever it might be that's way out of kilter with what I was expecting. It's very rare that you get a thank you. They're usually dealing with hardship, with vulnerable customers. And that is really adding to expectations. And then you overlay the challenges that the industry also has around mental health, not only for the staff, but also for customers as well. How do you work through that in a sympathetic, empathic sort of way with the right outcomes for both?
Fantastic. So this particular episode, the third in our series, is really looking at some of the challenges that contact centre managers and agents in the public sector face. And one of the things I wanted to ask you in terms of your understanding from the communication, the conversations that you have with your members, is what are the sort of particular issues that the government contact centres face, or rather perhaps the emphasis is different, maybe around topics such as budgeting and compliance and transparency and cybersecurity, and also look at some of the challenges that call centres face around delivering better customer experiences in an age of rising expectations. But if we start with the first part, if you look at the experience of specifically those agents and those contact centres in the public sector, what are some of the particular pressures that they face?
Well, I think it's very difficult for us as citizens to think of government without thinking of compliance, without thinking about legislation, and not necessarily thinking that government staff are empowered the same as you potentially see in the private sector. It's a sweeping statement, most government agencies, or the larger government agencies, tend to be dealing with very vulnerable customers. That is massive. Privacy, security, compliance, all those things that you've mentioned are key. And clearly, the government doesn't necessarily have as deep pockets as we would like them to have for our citizens. And we've certainly seen historically over the last 3 years with many government agencies being in the news, not necessarily for all the right reasons, around being able to answer phone calls within what is a reasonably expected time, or being able to turn cases around as quickly as one would expect or would hope. Budget is a hurdle or a challenge not only in the public sector, it's also a challenge in the private sector. I know there's a lot of viewpoints out there that it's really easy in the private sector to get money. Having come from the private sector myself, if I heard earnings per share one more time, it was almost a mantra that I could almost sing along with Kumbaya. So there are all those challenges that you have in the private sector, just different hurdles and different standards and different processes that need to be undertaken. I think the biggest challenge for government today is that citizens no longer expect to receive a suboptimal experience or a perceived suboptimal experience just because they're interacting with a government agency or department. Citizens are comparing, or customers are comparing, to their bank or a shop front. And the other thing that I think is becoming more and more important, and government agencies are probably leading the way with this in many respects, that contact centres are one of the best listening posts that any organisation or agency or department can have.
I was going to ask about that because it sort of strikes me that the role, or the perception, or the role, or even the prestige in which the call centre is held, is probably developing a bit. I mean, it sort of strikes me. One of the reasons I really wanted you on the show today was to ask you whether you expect that the value that contact centre managers and executives can deliver to their organisations is increasing as customer service and experience becomes more important, but also that value is being more readily and more easily recognised.
Well, Andrew, it goes without saying that, of course, I'd say contact centres are invaluable, else I wouldn't be doing my job properly. But being a listening post is absolutely key. It's also hearing what your customers are saying, but then what are you doing with that valuable information and insights to truly make a difference? How are you actually leveraging that? The other thing that's really critical and doesn't always happen as much as we would like in the industry is being present in the C-suite at the table. It's really critical to create the linkages between what organisational heads or department heads or agency heads are saying they're delivering, and linking that to delivery expectations and capability. And of course, key for all citizens and all customers is accessibility, and for your staff, the appropriate technology that underpins the interaction and empowerment is also key for those people.
The government, the workers in government contact centres and the executives who run those, is it almost a higher test in that the expectations of citizens are higher to the extent that they feel a kind of sense of proprietary ownership over it, that they expect the government to treat them differently to the way, say, for instance, a private company would treat them?
Look, I'm sure the exchanges are probably a little bit more emotionally charged, especially for citizens that are paying taxes or rates or whatever it might be, because it's how are you spending, and I can hear it now, you're spending my money, etc., etc. And let's face it, I've been known to do that myself, probably the customer from hell. I don't believe that the expectation is necessarily higher, but being valued and respected from a government agency or department would certainly be absolutely key, especially with many of those exchanges being with vulnerable customers.
Okay, so the final question I wanted to ask you, we've spent a lot of time in the first two episodes talking about the role of AI, machine learning, and chatbots. And one of the things that's come up in that conversation is that it's likely that the role of the agents and the capabilities of the agents in the future will need to change as the machine learning and the chatbots start to take care of some of the more sort of obvious process-driven concerns, and instead start to send through more complex problems to the agents to solve? Is your expectation and that of your members that the capabilities required of people in contact centres is likely to have to change over the next couple of years as a result of technology?
Andrew, absolutely. And we're already on the path, or we're already on the word that I don't like, on the journey. Roles have already started changing and will continue to change, but it's really exciting. It means more meaningful work, better employment opportunities in terms of career pathing within contact centres. So it's not that oldie worldy view of, battery hens all sitting in cubicles beavering away doing all the same stuff. It really is going to challenge people's innovation, their critical thinking, complexity of interactions, which means we're going to look for different qualities or attributes in the people that we're hiring. Those people are going to actually create the systems, the processes, work on the technology, innovate how to interact differently. And most importantly, and I still go back to this, they're still going to be adding that wonderful human touch, which is that critical component of what contact centres do every single day.
So just one final question then. If we go into that sort of idea that the nature of the job is likely to change and the capabilities required are likely to change, in your experience, just from the conversations that you've had with your members, from the work that you yourself have done, do you find that the public sector approach to kind of retraining and to equipping staff, is it similar to how it operates in the private sector, or is it different? Are there different pressures?
I think there are different pressures because the government and agencies and departments tend to be far more structured with their job grades and bands, etc. I think there is a movement for some more flexible thinking, some really smart stuff around innovation, which is creating that enabled workforce. Is anybody perfect at it yet, Andrew? No. Are we all learning as we go? Are we all seeing different challenges because our clients or our citizens have different expectations? It really means that we're going to shape what we do slightly differently, because we must always bear the customer in mind first, and then all the other, as one of my previous leaders used to say, all the sexy stuff, which was the technology, as it helps to deliver on the promise.
Fiona, that's a fantastic way to set the context for today's conversation. I'll ask you to stay around because we want to be able to take some questions from the audience, and some may come through for you. Now, just on that point, to our audience members, please feel free to type your questions into the place provided, and we will address those at the end of the webinar. So thank you, Fiona. My next guest is Justin Tippet. Justin is the founder of the CX Group Australia. And so Justin, again, as with Fiona, for those among our audience who aren't familiar with your work, can you just give us, just describe your background in the work of CX Group Australia?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, and g'day to everyone that's listening today. Look, I think most people probably know CX Group Australia more for CX Central. It's Australia's largest free resource site or website for contact centre and CX professionals. So basically, a whole bunch of articles, hundreds of articles, all without the vendor stuff, a glossary, industry events, calendar, white papers, business directory, etc. So basically, just a really good resource for people to go and learn more about call centres or customer experience. Outside of that, CX Group also does consulting. So we help businesses with their call center and customer experience. And when I'm bored, I've got a Facebook page now, which is gathering a bit of momentum for all the wrong reasons. In my spare time, I like to make memes about call center life. So I've got a page called Call Center Legends on Facebook. There's about 20,000 people now that follow it along. So if you want to laugh, yeah, make sure you check that out as well.
Fantastic. Now, one of the things I really liked about your background in doing research for today's event is that you've worked with a range of fairly high-profile organisations in this area: Australia Post, Mickey, Nespresso, Pizza Hut, Energy Australia, Seek, Telstra, and others. And I'm really interested in your insights into how do government and private sector companies think differently about customer service, and what's the strength that each can teach the other?
Yeah, it's nice question. Look, I think there was a time when there probably was a really distinct difference between sort of how the public and private sectors worked. But I think, as Fiona sort of alluded to earlier, the customer expectations are changing so quickly that they don't really care now when they're dealing with companies. So whether it's private or public, our expectations are the same. If I can, ring up and get a Uber, for example, it rocks up at my door, I can track it the whole way, it picks me up, it drops me off at my destination, don't even have to take money out of my wallet. It all just happens and it's magic. But when I want to ask a question about my tax or my local council or whatever it might be, why is it so painful, right? So we're not just benchmarking to private and public anymore as a consumer. We just benchmark against all our day-to-day experiences. And I think the other thing to also factor in now is that, I think there was always traditionally a belief that customer experience and cost efficiency were seen as two mutually exclusive goals. But I think now more than ever, the research is showing that those two, you can do both. You can improve the customer experience and lower your costs. So as an example, in the public sector, look at the Australian Tax Office. Jane King, who was on the board of AHS Contacts with Fiona, and they've done some amazing stuff. And last time I checked, the ATO doesn't have any competitors. There's only one government body taking most of my money, right? But they've done so much stuff now that you sort of go, wow, it's really easy now to pay my tax. I don't maybe begrudge it as much as I used to. And an example of technology for there is, voice biometrics. The ATO gets about 9 million calls a year, and 75% of them require verification. So when they introduced voice biometrics, not only was it a better customer experience because I didn't have to tell them my date of birth and my age and next of kin and all that sort of stuff, but it saved the ATO 40 seconds off every call. So there's cost efficiencies there. So I think, again, now more than ever, there's less of a distinction between public and private. I guess there are a few things, though, that still hang around in the private sector. And that is really the competition, I guess, is a lot more fierce. Just about everything is getting commoditized now in the private sector. They've got competition from online, door-to-door deliveries. So pretty much everyone's got a competitor. If you look at banks, there's, I can get a home loan from 10 different banks. So what separates one from the other? And what it's boiling down to is really around the customer experience. And I think Fiona mentioned earlier in her stats, about 90% of companies now realise that they've got to invest in the customer experience and think that they're doing a good job and putting customers first. But the same survey said that only about 8% of customers agreed that they're doing a great job in customer service. So there is really a big gap, I guess, between the two. And so the opportunities for the private sector really is to say, well, geez, we're in a really commoditized market. We have to put the customer first. And you know what? 84% of companies that work to improve their customer experience report an increase in their revenue. So there is that value. You don't have to just drive costs. You can get great customer service and get cost efficiencies as well.
So just one more point on this question. If I think of sort of the private sector, quite often the drivers are fairly obvious. They want to improve profitability. If they want to improve customer service levels, it's because that then feeds into greater share of wallet. What's the motivation in government? If a government manager or executive wants to make the argument that they need to invest in transforming the customer experience, what's the basis on which they're making the argument?
Yeah, I think there's two factors. One is, customer experience is still a driver, right? We want to provide better customer experiences, and traditionally people in the call center environment, are customer driven. We want to make sure that we provide good service, but there is no question now that cost is a big driver. So it's cost savings, and I think we've got a challenge in the industry, when we always talk about the touchy-feely stuff. So as an example, we redesigned our login process, and our customers are now 20% happier when they log in, or our NPS score went up by 6 points. That's great. But what we can also say is, hey, we redesigned our login process and we're saving $4 million a year due to customers now using self-service. So I think you can get both. I think the advantage is there for both. The smarter people in CX and contact centers are starting to speak the C-level language and putting it to dollars or cost savings rather than the customer experience, though.
Fantastic. So just to go into this point a little bit more, if you look specifically at contact center managers in the public sector, what do you see as the main pressures upon them? Budget, security, governance, and is the emphasis different to what you'd find in a private sector based on your fairly extensive experience?
Yeah, look, I think the three things you just mentioned, budget, security, government, are always at the forefront of contact center managers, regardless of the sector. But yeah, there are still some differences between public and private. And I guess I'll just preface that by saying that even within private and public, there's differences depending on the function of the call center. E.g., inbound complaints would have a very different objectives than an inbound sales team or an outbound telemarketing team. So I'm generalizing here, but some of the differences that I've noticed probably between public and private is one, I think it's really challenging for our public sector contact center managers to find ways to reward staff. Often the public sector just don't allow budgets for entertainment. It goes in the entertainment budget, which is frowned upon. We saw years ago, I think some ATO staff, having a end of year celebration on an island somewhere because it was a reward and recognition program, and that got slapped down pretty quickly. Taxpayers don't like seeing their funds being used for entertainment purposes. So there's a little bit more freedom, I guess, with our private contact center managers to do that. I think probably the pace of change is probably also a little bit quicker in the private sector. And again, Fiona touched on it earlier. There are lots of layers and lots of stakeholders in that public sector and very structured pay grades that are linked to competencies. So it can be a little bit harder to turn the ship around sometimes. I think the other one that has to be said is probably just that unionised environment. It takes a long time to negotiate your way through wanting to make changes because again, I guess it comes back to the stakeholders. But typically most of your government departments are quite heavily unionised, and I think retention is probably another issue. I remember from my days back then, and for the opposite reason, it's often hard to move people on from the contact centre. It's a nice stable job. They don't want to leave. They know they can probably go to part-time or flexible hours if they want to, and often you get stuck, dare I say it, with lots of difficult staff to manage. They always seem to end up in the call center and it becomes their problem. So outside of that, the challenges very much remain the same as, and again, Fiona touched on that earlier, recruitment, how to improve staff engagement, how to get more coaching done, etc.
Okay, so just the other thing I wanted to get your perspective on, again, because you've got a fairly broad experience set, is what I look at the issue of how technology has changed the role and capabilities of the contact center. And what's your sense of what technologies such as analytics, or more sort of contemporary analytics, machine learning, AI, automation, what's the impact of those as they take hold, basically? And do you see those feeding into a change in the role of agents and the work that they do?
Yeah, look, Andrew, I'm still old enough to remember the introduction of emails coming into the workplace. We've had faxes, SMS, social media, etc. And I remember every one of them, we always spoke about the death of the contact center. Obviously, that hasn't happened, but there's no doubt. The current technology that you touched on, with chatbots, AI, and even voice analytics, they're all starting to have an impact. I just got back from a couple of weeks in the Philippines, and like here, just about every contact center I visit is experiencing a reduction in call volumes. We're finding that whether it's through chatbots, machine learning, better self-help on websites, etc., the call volumes that are coming into the call center are certainly lower. But while the call volumes are declining, the complexity of those calls is increasing. And I think what you find is, and you probably do it yourself, Andrew, is if you've got a reason to contact a company, the first thing you normally do is go to Google, right, or go to their website. You're trying to find the answer. You'll do pretty much everything to avoid ringing the call center. So of course, what that means is when those calls do get to the call center, they are just becoming a little bit more complex. And that, of course, has some flow-on effects to us in the call center channel. One is, one of the traditional metrics that call centers have often used, much to my disgust sometimes, is average handle time. Just on average, how long each conversation is going for. And we're seeing across the globe in every study that I've read that's increasing, and that reflects the fact that those conversations are becoming more complex. And I think where it becomes a bit challenging is we think, well, all this technology is reducing call volumes, but I actually need more staff because the conversations are going longer. And that's really hard for people to get their head around, because a lot of the business cases on, I think, technology have been built around driving out costs. but we're actually seeing in some respects the opposite of that is happening. The other flow-on effect is just the ability to empower our agents to resolve more complex issues. We need to give them better information. We need to give them better tools. There's no point just giving them the same amount of information that's on the website. Because we're going to have the same conversations with the customers. They need to be that one step ahead. So they need better training and tools and everything to make sure that they're ready to handle that.
So just on keeping on the technology question for the time being, the other big trend, which I'm sure you've seen and your customers have experienced, is this sort of trend from disparate in-house systems to outsourcing to software as a service and cloud-based systems that are more integrated. I'm just wondering, from your perspective, are there particular issues for governments and agencies that want to look at moving to cloud computing that are slightly harder or are different to the public sector? And if you think of the complexity of that change from moving from a sort of legacy in-house system that might be an amalgam of things to an outsourced cloud-based system, how much do you think that the issues around that are technology issues, and how much of it is like a cultural issue, like an aversion to change?
So a lot of points in that question. So let me tackle it. Look, I think for cloud solutions, more than ever, it's certainly a viable option for most businesses. And the concerns that I think were early days around security and data governance and compliance, they're all well and truly resolved. And I'm sure Jim will talk to those points a little bit later. And when you banks, the ATO, health insurance companies, etc., all using cloud solutions, that should give people a little bit of comfort that, geez, if it's good enough for the tax office to be using or a bank to be using, then maybe there's not those concerns that I actually thought of. There's certainly a lot of benefits to moving to the cloud. Some of those are cost benefits. So just moving from having to buy lots of hardware and maintain that to an OPEX model or contact center as a service is certainly an advantage for a lot of businesses and government departments. It's easily scalable and you can get access to some pretty cool technology that was previously really cost prohibitive. So I guess just to touch more on the cultural elements, I think like any change in a contact center and with humans, we don't typically cope well with it. So, the challenge with moving is really just making sure you involve your call center people in the process and have a really strong change management program with realistic timelines. It can be a big shift when you're moving across. Culturally, most of the centres that I've been involved with that have moved across, it's actually been very welcomed by the call centre agents because, typically the thing that frustrates them the most is the tools that they're left to manage all the customers with. So when you go to cloud, you start to get omni-channel and they don't have to switch between 20 different systems. They get more information about the customer that comes through with a call. And, even things like work from home, which, previously may not have been an option, is a lot easier with a cloud-based solution. So, so certainly, culturally, I think as long as you involve them in the process, give them lots of training, you're going to be pretty successful in terms of transitioning over. And from a tech perspective, no one's breaking new ground here anymore. The vendors are quite experienced now in transitioning centres from old legacy platforms to the cloud. So I think, to be honest, there's no reason why most people shouldn't be seriously looking at it. And I think I read a survey literally just about a month ago. I think 65% of Australian call centres right now are all looking at moving to a cloud-based solution.
Okay. So the other thing about the new software platforms that are architected from the ground up is the idea that analytics are kind of central to how they're constructed. I think it'd be really interesting to get you to talk a little bit about the kinds of things that organizations could learn from the analytics that their contact centers generate compared to the past. So not so much the contact center managers and staff who have got that frontline exposure, but for the other executives who can get access to data out of the contact centers. What are the kinds of things that organizations and government departments and agencies can learn now from that more sort of sophisticated approach to analytics?
Yeah, look, I think Fiona really hit the nail on the head before when she mentioned the word listening post. I think it's a great word to use around describing the value that the contact centers can now add back to organizations. I mean, traditionally, I think, data's always been the Achilles heel of the call centers. We've had so much data, we didn't know what data to look at, from GOS and AHT and all that stuff to managing the call centers. But as you sort of mentioned just then around, well, what about all that qualitative stuff? What about all the information about customers that you're getting? And now it's never been easier. Previously we used to listen to about 5 calls per agent per month. And anyone who's listening who's run a contact center probably goes, yeah, that's what we do. But I think now when you look at things like speech analytics, you can gain insight into every call that comes into your call center. So, and in simple terms, for those that aren't too familiar with speech analytics, in my simplistic way, it just transcribes the phone call into words, and then you can just search like a database. So as an example, if you wanted to know how many customers rang in and were complaining about an increase in price or wait times or whatever it might be, you can just punch in the search criteria and get the answer practically instantly around how many people are calling about that. So it's a huge amount of data that the call centers now are at the front and center of, being able to help guide departments, organizations, ministers, etc., with what customers are actually saying, what they're calling about, what issues they're reporting on, what's the hot topics, etc. And you don't have to wait weeks, months to get that data. It's there, it's real time.
So one of the issues with data, obviously, is one thing is getting the insights. The other thing is then turning the insights into action. There's a perception, I think, sometimes that governments are slower at that, but what's your experience?
Yeah, I think that's probably a reasonable perception. But I think, we're partly to blame because we haven't been too good at actually getting information, out there and being able to analyze data quickly. Even when you look at NPS surveys, they really shouldn't be used for transactional based, surveys, but a lot of people do. They take them on at the end of the phone call, etc. But, traditionally they're supposed to be longer term surveys. So there is normally a lag between doing something and seeing the impact of it from your customers. I think that's where the value of the speech analytics stuff is, because it quite generally you can mine your data instantly and it's real time. I know some private sector companies that are using it, so they use it for market intelligence. This isn't an example, but to make it really easy, if you're Foxtel, for example, and people are ringing up Foxtel and saying, well, I've just noticed that Disney have just brought out their new packages literally today and it's $9. They're going to see that coming through in that data straight away. And that's something that they can feed up to the senior executive team and go, hey, what are we going to do about this? So we're getting all this information that just previously would take months to filter through surveys. So it's a changing time, but I think it's an exciting time and it puts us in a really good position.
Fantastic. And a final question for you today as well. Both you and yourself, you and Fiona, as I mentioned at the start of the episode, were both recently nominated as top 25 customer experience influencers. How do you see the role of the contact center impacting customer experience both now and in the future?
Yeah, thanks. It was pretty cool to be included and alongside Fiona. It's, I think Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, was famous for saying the best customer service is if the customer doesn't need to call you, doesn't need to talk to you, and it just works. So when you hear that, you sort of go, oh, geez, I wonder what role the contact center does have in the future, right? Because if everyone actually sorts their proverbial out, no one's going to be calling the call center, because traditionally we just handle inquiries and complaints and fix problems. But I think utopia is a long way from happening for most businesses. So I think there's still plenty of life left purely just on that basis alone. But I truly believe right now, for people that are in the contact center space, there is an amazing opportunity to take the lead on driving those customer experience initiatives within an organization. I mean, the call center managers have got some amazing skills, tools, and they're obviously passionate about customers, and they're close to the customer. So I think it's really just an opportunity for us to sort of say, hey, let's get out there, let's drive it. And as I sort of mentioned earlier, it's about probably starting to change our language a little bit and start actually talking the same languages at C-level and talking around, return on investments or, profitability, etc. So don't always link things to NPS and customer satisfaction. Actually show them the difference these things are having on the bottom line. And I think what you'll find is that call centers are going to become integral part of most businesses and the customer experience.
Excellent, Justin. Thank you very much for that. The questions have started coming in, so I'll ask you to stick around, and we'll throw some of those to you at the end of the session as well. My next guest is Jim Chriskos. Jim is the National Solutions Manager for Customer Experience at NEC Australia. And I want to talk to Jim today about the issues which Fiona and Justin have raised. These issues sit at the heart of the work that Jim and his team do, helping companies implement cloud-based solutions that improve customer service and experiences. Now, Jim, in the past, customer service has often been considered almost a necessary cost, but the sense I get from the work that we've done over the last couple of months is that the contact center is increasingly seen as something which needs to be considered almost as the center of the orbit. It's a central part of the overall engagement strategy with the customers. Is that a trend that you see in the public sector as well as in the private sector? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
Look, the answer is yeah, it's definitely a trend. And I think if I could paraphrase Fiona a little bit, she was talking about, you know, the interactions with the citizens are, they're usually emotional. The word I'll use is complex, right? So if you think about it, you've got these complex interactions that need to be addressed, and then the world is talking about this digital disruption. What that means is you're going to have a whole bunch of different ways to interact with the same people, requiring advice. Now, at the same time, we know that, you know, governments are, or the federal government and state governments are looking at initiatives to move jobs out to regional areas, and I think the contact centre obviously is a great fit for that sort of initiative. So, you know, I'm not going to say that contact centres for government are not going to go anywhere at all. They're going to be very, very important, probably to the end of time, actually.
So for departments and agencies that are looking to improve service levels by achieving a sort of end-to-end view of the interaction that they have with their customers, why is it important to equip those frontline staff with sophisticated and contemporary tools? What's the business impact of doing so?
Well, I think ultimately the business impact is to drive up the customer experience and the customer satisfaction, right? So if you look at it from a historical perspective, where we had a lot of legacy on-premise systems, they were kind of built as required. So you start off with a PABX, an ACD, an IVR, call recording solution, knowledge management, possibly analytics, and then they would just be bolt-on pieces, would not necessarily be from the same vendor, and therefore the agent level, the front line, you've got agents probably requiring 2 or 3 or 4 different interfaces to handle an interaction, which, you know, it doesn't provide a great customer experience. So nowadays, having the right tools, having that integrated tool set, the one pane of glass, as we like to call it, to be able to provide agents with things like journey information that show how the customer arrived on their phone, or why they're interacting via email, that, you know, potentially they've tried 2 or 3 different ways to interact, and this is the nature of the query, helps the agent. It's critical to driving up the customer experience. Again, and there's other tools like using artificial intelligence to support the agents, to serve knowledge to them, to help to assist them in identifying areas where, you know, there's information around that the customer consume, and they can push those knowledge bites to the customer as well. You know, and things like, you know, if you overlay analytics to these sorts of things, you can understand sentiment analysis and those sorts of things that help the agent understand, you know, the intent and obviously the sentiment behind the call. So all these tools assist in providing a continuous improvement. And I'm sorry, I'm going to offend Justin by talking about AHT, but you know, the research says it's going to reduce AHT and first call resolution, ultimately drive up customer satisfaction. And I guess for the employee themselves, you know, they're more engaged, they're more empowered, and obviously that means that, you know, there's for the company or for the agency, there's a reduction in churn. So it's a benefit all around.
All right, so in a lot of the conversations we've had in recent months with public sector tech execs in this area, the kinds of issues that tend to come up early in the conversation are things like cybersecurity, data governance, compliance. Now, they come up in the private sector as well, but the emphasis seems to be a bit different. Can you describe, if you're looking at sort of a cloud-based approach to addressing some of these issues, how does a cloud-based approach make addressing these issues either easier or more thorough or more effective?
Sure. So again, you know, if you look at the research, it does say that essentially, you know, if you look at it historically, that the risk appetite was low for cloud, and the underlying reason was security. But it also says over time, the appetite will increase as vendors improve their security postures. I don't know if you've seen the major announcement recently from Microsoft in the US, but they've just won a $10 billion cloud project with the US government. That's a major win. Now, and so, you know, we're in a situation now where cloud vendors addressing all these security concerns. They're getting the appropriate certifications, such as FedRAMP, for example, which is a federal government security requirement, understanding that they can't do business in government unless they achieve those certifications. And they're leveraging the underlying infrastructure to do that, and then obviously making their platforms more secure. And the issue of compliance is an interesting one, because if you look at it from PCI perspective, I guess there's two elements to it, right? The first part of it is technology compliance. And again, these vendors now with these cloud solutions, they are PCI compliant, and they provide a certificate of attestation, every 12 months to prove it. And if you were to consider that in an on-premise world, that's something that you need to take on board as the owner of that environment, and be able to do that periodically to make sure that you're meeting those technical requirements. The second part of the PCI compliance piece is the process around how the agents are handling the interactions and whatever. And cloud with is part of the answer, because you can use analytics to understand if you're in or out of compliance on particular interactions, and then you can address those.
So maybe just the same question I was asking Justin before. If you think of as organizations look at the shift from on-prem to cloud, and they look at the kinds of issues they're going to need to deal with, do you think the complexity resides in the technology shift, or does it reside more on the cultural shift?
It depends on your viewpoint. And I think maybe if I'm picking up the underlying sentiment of the question, I think maybe there's a perception that the shift to cloud is a big bang approach, which not necessarily is. I think, one of the things that you can, I guess, benefits you can derive out of cloud is you can adopt a services approach, or a small, trial a service in the cloud if you like it, then expand that service, try the next one, etc. It's not necessarily, get rid of your previous solution and let's go cloud as a big bang approach. So from that perspective, there's ways you can reduce the risk and all those sorts of things. Culturally, I think what changes is the conversation inside. I think, traditionally what would happen is, you would, if you wanted to embark on an initiative, then you would need to raise a business case, justify your return of investment. You would then get authorization to complete a project, which, that process could take 18 months, and then you'd need to lifecycle manage that environment until the end of time. But what we're seeing now is that technology-based conversation has reduced a lot with cloud. So there's still a little bit of it, not as much as before, but it's more of a business-focused conversation, and it's easier to justify the business case. So, culturally, you're moving away from tech discussions and you're moving more to, business discussion. And I think, specifically to government, I think it's a benefit, because, you're talking about budget cycles of 12 months, and you're talking about, efficiency gain targets. You don't want to be stuck, don't want to be in a position where you need to spend the first 6 months of that 12-month cycle trying to justify a business case to execute on an initiative, and then only have six months to realize that benefit. Whereas with cloud, for example, it might take you less time, might take you 3 months, for argument's sake, to justify the business case, and then you're executing on that initiative for 9 months, and then more likely to realize the benefits.
Okay, well, the other issue which often comes up when we chat to our readers in the public sector is that the cost models come up quite a bit in discussion. And I'm wondering if you could address this issue from the perspective of government buyers, who often have a different set of pressures and priorities on them to their colleagues in the private sector.
Yeah,
so the cost models around cloud.
Yeah. Obviously, if we were having this discussion in private sector, the whole thing would be about revenue, right? But that doesn't apply in this case. So it's really about, reduction in cost. And it's realised in a couple of ways, okay, I think. And the first one is consumption IT. And, we've got customers who, on a day-to-day basis, but their requirement for agents is about 2,700 seats, 3,000 seats, that sort of thing. On their peak, which is only a couple of months a year, sometimes less, that goes up to about 8,000 seats. But unfortunately, they're in that position where they had to buy those licenses, and essentially they sit on the shelf, and you can't use them, you can't do anything with them, you can't lease them to anyone else. So they sit on the shelf and they're not being utilized. But the whole thing around cloud is that the value prop is that, you know, you consume as required. So, you know, on the 10 months of the year when you're not using the 6 or 8,000, that's not an issue. And when you do, they're there to be used, right? So that's part of the story. The other part of it is the innovation piece, right? So some people might think, well, how does innovation play in government? But, you know, anything to drive the customer experience up, anything obviously to get that, to hit that efficiency gain target, you can leverage the cloud piece to do that. And I think the conversations are more around about, you know, it's a reduction in the CapEx spend and more of an OpEx play. And that also for the finance department is a great benefit, because, you know, if they're looking at increasing their capability, whatever, it's pretty easy for them to model out what their costs are going to look like. So I think, you know, obviously the cost profiles of these solutions changes.
All right, so a final question before we go to a couple of audience questions. And I wanted to particularly ask you about analytics and get you to describe the benefits for organizations that use their analytics better to understand how their employees are interacting with their customers, and how this can be, this better understanding can then be sort of fed back into the organization for further innovation.
Sure. So I think, you know, the analytics piece is, I break it down into three pieces. And the compliance piece we spoke about earlier, right? So it's one thing to have a technical compliance on the platform, but being able to analyze 100% of the conversations, which was what Justin was talking about before, whereas that wasn't possible in the past, using an analytics engine is of great benefit. And then being able to address what's in and out of compliance pretty much near real time is a good thing for everybody, right? The second part of it is analytics and quality management. So being able to scrutinize, again, 100% of the calls, but understand, you know, who are your good performing agents, who are your not so good performing agents, what are your opportunities for training, what are your opportunities for improvement, and those sorts of things. And I guess lastly is the efficiency piece, is trying to derive data out of analytics that will show potentially where, you know, you've got some issues, what potential solutions can be. And then, you know, sometimes in those cases, the analytics actually can be fed into, you know, robotic process automation or AI and derive benefits that way. So, you know, there's a lot to be gained from analytics, and I think it's a common or a similar case between enterprise and government. There's the same benefits there. I think the call out though is with analytics is that, you know, it's not one of those set and forget solutions where, you know, you just deploy a bit of kit and just read some reports and action them. You need somebody to manage that environment, understand the data, drill into the data, and then get to the root causes and those sorts of things. So there's a bit of ongoing work around analytics required to derive the best outcome.
Fantastic, thank you, thank you, Jem. We'll now move to the audience question part of today's episode. There's still time if you want to add a question there, but the first question is an issue which has come up already in the conversation, which is in responding to new complexities brought about by technology or new ways of operating, we need the agents to be better equipped, and one of the approaches we can do that is we can train them. But the question is, do we need to retrain agents, or are their roles likely to change so much that we're more likely to be hiring different types of people as agents in future? That's my interpretation of the question. Fiona, perhaps I might throw this question to you. Do you see the kinds of people who are working in contact centers in future coming with a different set of skills and perhaps being more skilled than in the past?
Andrew, thank you for that question. I think the answer is both. There will still be a need for agents to be doing the complex interactions that they're doing today. Can some of those people, or do some of those people, wish to be trained in doing analytics or whatever it might be, there is certainly an opportunity there. Are we going to be looking for different skills in the future, possibly as foundational attributes that we will look for? I think the one thing that we need to recognise is that with any form of artificial intelligence or anything that's automated, there is no emotional intelligence, there is no ability with empathy. So we're still going to be looking for that in our agents as we go forward. So I know that's a bit of a non-answer, with the answer being both, but from our perspective, it's about what a wonderful career path and wonderful opportunity for people of today, not dinosaurs like myself, but it is really a great opportunity in terms of how people wish to advance and wish to continue with their career in the contact centre.
Fantastic. And the final question we've got, it's an interesting one, where the listener has asked or said that they think their experience in the private sector is that often organisations struggle to marry digital and traditional interactions. So I presume a web interaction with perhaps a phone interaction or a branch interaction, particularly from the perspective of quality assurance. Is this a similar problem that we find in the public sector as well? Justin, I might throw that to you, and Jim, I might get you to close off that answer as well. And we've got about 4 minutes, so I can ask you to be direct in the answers.
Yeah, it'll be nice and quick. Oh, look, they're different skill sets, and I think that's one of the challenges, whether you're in private or public. The skills required to do a voice call are very different to responding to an email or to doing a live chat conversation. So I think the problems exist. I think the technology is getting better. So that we talk about omni-channel a lot now. So that the ability technically to be able to do both for an agent has never been easier. But to me, they're still very different skill sets, and I think to find someone who's amazing in their grammar and everything, and is also amazing at the verbal skills on the phone, they're often two very different things. So I think we'll still have some challenges around making genuine omni-channel, capable agents, whether you're in private or public.
Thank you. And Jim, you and I think we discussed this in the previous episode, this idea of creating a genuine omni-channel experience for the customers. I might get you to address that from the perspective of a cloud solution. How would a cloud solution be better at delivering that outcome than, say, an on-prem solution?
Oh, Andrew, it's the cliche of, the data is oil cliche, right? So, and I think Justin touched on it earlier, where, if you go back to, those legacy on-prem solutions and look at the way they were built, multiple point solutions being put together, integrated together to provide a service for a customer. You've got a situation where you've got multiple databases, and you've got CRM databases, you've got knowledge databases, you've got file systems with data, and spreadsheets and whatever else. The data's all over the place. It's not that easy to consume, to be able to provide that omni-channel experience. But the new, I guess, breed of cloud native solutions, and probably, notably the single vendor cloud native solutions, a consolidated approach to data, and that data being able to be consumed by various elements of the solution. That's where the benefit's going to be. It's streamlining. There's no requirement for integration anymore. It's all there.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you to Justin and Fiona too. That brings us to the end of today's episode. All 3 episodes in our series will be available online, and we will provide all the audience members with that information. We thank you very much for your time today. We value your time and for your input, and we thank those people who provided questions as well. My name is Andrew Birmingham. I'm the editor of Which 50. Thank you all very much, and good afternoon.